Canadian representatives. 250% for dairy products. Tariff. But very importantly, tomorrow tariffs 25% on Canada.
My government understands that Canadians hurt by the unjustified tariffs will need our support. Fighting back against U.S. tariffs and protecting our workers are most immediate priorities.
What if the greatest risk to U.S. energy security didn't come from Iran or Russia, but from its most trusted ally? Welcome to the Strategic Flow, where every analysis unveils the behind-the-scenes dynamics of global power. Today, we explore how Canada's decision to reassess its energy export policy triggered a quiet strategic response from the Trump administration, with implications that extend beyond oil, striking at the logistical and political foundations of the North American market. Every system has a pressure point, and for the American economy, it runs underground, encased in steel and driven by constant pressure. Every day, over 4.3 million barrels of oil cross the Canadian border silently. They don't draw attention, they don't make noise, but they sustain the backbone of U.S. energy. In early 2025, this predictable operation hit an unexpected fracture. An unofficial memo, no public announcement, indicated that the U.S. government would impose 25% tariffs on Canadian imports. The exception, oil and gas, with a reduced 10% rate. It was a technical adjustment, but the meaning was geopolitical. The signal alone turned a hypothesis into a threat. What if Canada decided to retaliate at the one point where it holds real leverage? The possibility of disrupting North America's most critical energy supply wasn't explicitly stated. It didn't need to be. Investors, refineries, and officials got the message. Oil could become a tool of pressure, a silent weapon in a game that had so far avoided such escalation. What if the next crisis in gas prices, energy bills, or supermarket shelves isn't caused by war, but by an almost imperceptible shift in the flow of a pipeline? This isn't theory, it's what nearly happened. Without firing a single formal sanction, Canada showed it could push the United States to the operational edge of its energy security. Washington noticed and backed off, not out of diplomacy, but calculation. Because at the heart of this tension wasn't just barrels, but a logistical dependency impossible to replace in the short term. And while most of the public remained unaware of this maneuvering, you're hearing it now, early. Because here at the Strategic Flow, we don't follow the noise, we follow the signal. Like so many trade disputes in recent history, it began with displays of strength, impactful tariffs, and headlines that inflame, then fade. But behind the scenes, the chessboard was different. When Donald Trump returned to the presidency in January 2025, the pattern seemed familiar. A flurry of executive orders, surcharges on strategic partners, and a revival of combative trade rhetoric. Among these measures, a 25% tariff was slapped on most Canadian imports. But one sector got special treatment: energy. Canadian oil would face only a 10% tariff, a decision that was no accident. The reason? Simple. The U.S. logistical system cannot function without this steady flow of Canadian barrels. This isn't a fringe take. Energy policymakers and major industry players understand this dependency with precision. Canadian oil now accounts for about 60% of all U.S. imports, more than the combined volume from OPEC, Mexico, or any other international supplier. Beyond quantity, it's about technical specificity. Refineries across the industrial Midwest, in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois, are calibrated to process one exact type of oil, heavy, viscous, with chemical properties that domestic sources, like Texas's light crude, can't easily replicate. Replacing it isn't a matter of choice. It's an engineering, timing, and billion-dollar infrastructure problem. Most of the public is unaware of this structure, and among those who know, few are willing to voice an uncomfortable truth. A vital part of U.S. energy resilience hinges on the stability of its relationship with Canada, a bond that until recently was taken for granted. But in 2025, that certainty began to erode. Canada's initial response followed the classic playbook of any trade friction: retaliatory tariffs on predictable sectors, agriculture, metals, familiar industrial chains. It was the usual game. But something shifted in March. The rhetoric, once defensive, began signaling a strategic willingness to escalate. In a seemingly casual interview, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister dropped a surgically calculated line. Of course, there's oil and gas. We've kept that in our hand. Just that. But the impact was immediate. To the average person, it sounded vague. To energy markets, it was a clear code. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a move of deterrence. Silent, precise, and potentially disruptive. Operators understood. Canada was officially putting its most valuable card on the table. The threat was hypothetical, but markets don't operate on certainties. They operate on risks, and the risk was now systemic. The price of Canadian oil reacted sharply. U.S. refineries went into contingency mode, accelerating stockpiles. Calls flooded Washington from industry executives on high alert because they knew, and always have, how short the fuse is when energy supply comes under strategic strain. Some variables move markets, others keep presidents up at night. A shock to oil supply, especially during an election cycle, falls into the latter category. If you're still here, it's not for entertainment. It's because you understand that real power doesn't announce itself, it shifts, and understanding how it moves puts you ahead of those who merely react to its effects. Days after the initial jolt in the U.S., US-Canada energy axis, tension gave way to precision. The chessboard was no longer in the traditional diplomatic arena. It was before a highly selective audience: oil industry executives, institutional investors, risk analysts, and U.S. regulators. The stage: the S&P Global CERAWeek Conference, one of the energy sector's most strategic global gatherings. There, Canada's Energy Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, spoke. Few words, no rhetorical excess, but every sentence carried deliberate architecture. We don't seek escalation, but we have options. That was it, and yet it was everything. It wasn't an explicit threat, it was a calibrated signal, a subtle message that Canada wasn't bluffing, just waiting for the other side's next move. Because in the logic of strategic interdependence, the most powerful gesture is the one that doesn't need to be executed, only perceived as possible. For over half a century, the US-Canada energy relationship was treated as an unchangeable constant, structurally shielded by decades of mutual trust, multilateral agreements, and logistical integration. Since World War II, no Canadian government had ever considered using oil as a pressure tool. The line was clear, and it had never been crossed. Until now. The mere act of Canada approaching this unspoken boundary was enough to trigger automatic reactions across the system. Markets didn't wait for formal statements. They anticipated. The price gap between Western Canadian Select, WCS, and West Texas Intermediate, WTI, historically around $15 per barrel, plummeted to less than half that. To operators, it wasn't a normal fluctuation. It was a flashing red alert on the systemic risk radar. U.S. refineries launched a coordinated stockpiling effort, buying and storing Canadian oil as if it could become inaccessible at any moment. Because when energy supply enters the political arena, supply chains don't wait for instructions. They act. While the spotlight remained on public statements, the alert level hit critical behind the scenes. The American Petroleum Institute issued urgent memos directly to the White House. CEOs of major refineries activated unofficial influence channels. The activity was quiet, but intense. High-stakes institutional and financial actors were already operating under maximum pressure, and for good reason. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, estimated at about 350 million barrels, sounds robust, until weighed against real consumption. At the current pace of the U.S. economy, that volume covers less than 3 months of demand, and only partially. This isn't a crisis solvable with emergency drilling, nor with slogans like Buy American, because the problem is logistical and chemical. Canadian oil flows south through specific pipelines, and those pipelines are unidirectional, literally and geopolitically. Refineries in strategic states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania weren't designed to process just any oil. They were fine-tuned over decades for one specific raw material: Canadian heavy crude. Not by chance, but as a direct result of 30 years of highly specialized economic interdependence. There's no emergency switch. There's no detour. There's only one infrastructure, and one expectation: that it never stops running. This story didn't make headlines. It unfolded on the system's margins, where decisions are made before the public notices. The fact that you're here now signals a clear stance. You're already ahead of the curve, even if you didn't plan to be. And what was at stake went beyond physical infrastructure. It was a mathematical equation. If Canada even partially disrupted oil supply, internal projections pointed to an immediate spike in gasoline prices, between 30% and 50% within weeks. These figures weren't speculative. They were in the Trump economic team's confidential reports. The crisis wasn't just diplomatic. It was electorally costly. In a campaign year, a fuel price shock doesn't just hit consumption. It erodes trust, distorts indicators, and can shift the emotional axis of an entire election. While Trump's public rhetoric remained combative, full of strength and nationalist flair, his technical team operated on a different logic: containment. Pressure was eased quietly, without formal announcements or explicit concessions. Not out of goodwill, but out of strategic necessity. Because, behind closed doors, top advisors acknowledged a point rarely voiced publicly: Canada held real leverage. And at that moment, It was no longer theoretical. As Washington sought containment routes, the impasse crossed the border and met resistance within Canada itself. The idea of using oil as a geopolitical tool wasn't just poorly received on the international market. It became politically explosive at home, especially in Alberta. Responsible for over 80% of Canada's oil production, Alberta is the country's energy powerhouse. But its leadership didn't endorse Ottawa's bluff. Premier Danielle Smith was blunt. Cutting exports to the U.S. was unacceptable, not out of political alignment, but because the province's economy depends entirely on that flow. Here's the crux. 97% of Canada's exported oil goes straight to the U.S. There's no plan B, no sufficient refineries, no alternative pipeline to Asia, no replacement buyers. The entire infrastructure was built for one destination, south. If the U.S. stops buying, Alberta doesn't slow down, it stops. When Ottawa hinted at cutting oil supply, Alberta saw through it immediately. It wasn't a real threat, it was a bluff, a dangerous bluff, like sawing off the branch you're sitting on, with your neighbor still beside you. Economists framed it precisely: interdependence with reciprocal risk. The US can't lose Canadian oil without facing a supply crisis, and Canada can't survive without the US as a customer. Both hold the power to inflict damage on the other, but neither has a path to victory. It's the classic concept of mutually assured destruction, not with weapons, but with barrels. As economist Daniel Treffler put it, Canada threatening to cut off oil is like sawing off the branch it's sitting on, with the neighbor still next to it. When rhetoric threatened to turn into concrete action, Canada's political landscape took an unexpected turn. In March, mounting tension broke through the institutional surface. Justin Trudeau stepped down. In his place came Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England and Bank of Canada, a technocrat with global credentials, not a traditional politician. Carney brought a different tone, direct, calculated, with no room for populist rhetoric. In his first statement, he said, "This isn't business as usual. We've pledged to resist U.S. tariffs, and Canada is ready to do what it's never considered before." It was, possibly, a bluff, but a credible one, because coming from a global financial architect, the threat wasn't expressed in sound bites. It was in signals that investors take seriously. By April, a quiet shift emerged in Washington's strategic equation. Trump's intense nationalist rhetoric still dominated speeches, but behind the scenes, reality differed. Canada's leverage wasn't symbolic. It was logistical, operational, immediate. A new round of tariffs was announced. Steel, aluminum, technology. Public charts listed affected countries, but one absence stood out: Canada. No mention, no tariffs, no escalation. High-level sources confirmed what markets already assumed. Canada and Mexico were quietly exempted. No formal statements, no headlines. It was a strategic retreat. No fanfare, no press conference. Just the pressure vanishing, as if it had never existed. The reason was technical and unavoidable. The U.S. energy architecture simply couldn't withstand the risk of rupture. Disrupting Canadian oil flow would cause more damage to the American economy than any political gain could offset. And so, for the second time in a single quarter, the U.S. backed down quietly. Not out of defeat, but out of calculation, because they understood exactly what was at stake. By mid-April, markets began to stabilize, not because the impasse was resolved, but because it was contained. Oil kept flowing, valves stayed open, and signs of relief were immediate. The panic subsided. Investors eased off preemptive buying. The WCS-WTI price gap returned to its usual range. Refineries normalized operations. In everyday American life, the impact was moderate. Gasoline prices rose 5 to 20 cents per gallon, a noticeable but manageable hit in the short term. The impasse's impact wasn't just economic, it was structural and perceptual. For the first time in recent history, the U.S. faced an invisible limit. The much-touted energy independence proved more fragile than imagined. Pipelines stopped being seen as mere infrastructure. They became critical arteries, exposed. And Canada, without ever halting the flow, clearly showed what could happen if it did. That's real leverage, wielding power without needing to act on it. Across the border, Canada felt the effects too. After an export surge in January, the pace slowed. By March, the economy stalled. The Bank of Canada responded with a drastic rate cut from 5% to 2.75% to preserve consumption and curb the slowdown. It worked, but at the edge of maneuverability. In the end, one truth stood out. The US-Canada energy relationship isn't just about trade, it's vital interdependence. Pipelines, refineries, and silent contracts keep both economies linked by necessity, not choice. The Canadian threat never materialized, but the message was enough. Without touching a single barrel, Canada showed it could. And the US backed off, not out of weakness, but because there was no safe alternative. The so-called energy independence revealed its fragility. This wasn't a rhetorical dispute. It was an invisible redrawing of the geopolitical balance, a moment when power was measured not in weapons, but in infrastructure. The crisis was averted, for now, But the leverage remains, under the tracks, under the soil, under every strategic decision that depends on what comes from the north. This kind of analysis doesn't reach most people, but it's reached you now. And you? Did you see this as a strategic move, or just a sign of vulnerability? Comment below, because here, analysis is part of the strategy. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the next silent shift in global power.